A small hand reached across the table toward a plate of meat. A man's fist came down hard and rattled the cups. The boy flinched back and dropped to the floor. Every voice in the great hall stopped at once. 200 people held their breath. A small, thin child stood alone before the highest seat. His knees shook under him, but he lifted his chin and asked one quiet question. "May I eat what you did not finish?" The man on the throne was the coldest ruler these mountains had ever known. Years ago he banished his own mate on the word of a liar, and he never once wept. Now he stared down at a little boy with pale silver eyes. The same silver eyes he saw every morning in his own mirror. What made this hard king go still and cold? Stay with me on this one. Let me take you back a few hours before that boy ever stood in front of that throne, because you need to understand where he came from, and you need to understand what it cost him just to walk into that room. High up in the mountains, behind stone walls that had stood for 300 years, lived the Ironclaw Pack. It was the strongest pack in the north. Warriors trained in the courtyards every morning. Fires burned in the great hall every night. And down below all of that in the kitchens, a woman scrubbed the floors on her hands and knees. Her name was Mara Voss, and once, believe me, she had been someone. She had been a healer, one of the best the mountains had ever seen. She could set a broken bone so it healed straight. She could pull a fever out of a child in a single night. Warriors used to line up outside her door. Mothers used to bless her name, but that was before. Now she wore a gray dress worn thin at the elbows, and she carried a bucket of dirty water down halls where people looked away from her. Nobody said her name anymore. To them she was just the floor woman, the lowborn, the one they didn't talk about. And she had a son, a small boy 6 years old named Bram. Bram was thin, too thin. His wrists were narrow as sticks, and his cheeks had that hollow look that comes from never quite getting enough to eat. He had a cough in the winter that scared his mother more than she ever let him see. But here is the thing about Bram. He was gentle. He was the kind of child who caught spiders in his hands and carried them outside instead of stepping on them. He was the kind of child who shared his one piece of bread with the barn cats. And he had eyes, pale silver eyes, rare eyes, the kind you almost never see in a lowborn child. Mara had taught him to keep his head down. She taught him that every single day. Do not look them in the eye, she told him. Do not speak unless you are spoken to. Stay small. Stay quiet. Stay alive. Because in this pack, a lowborn who forgot their place did not last long. They slept together on a straw mattress in a room off the kitchen. It was cold. In the mornings, Mara would wake first and warm her hands over the coals so that when she touched her son's face, her fingers would not be like ice. She would go without food so he could have a little more. She had grown so thin herself that the other kitchen women whispered about it. But she never complained. Not once. She had learned a long time ago that complaining changed nothing. Now, the man who ruled all of this was Alpha King Dominic Thornwood. If you have ever met a man who stopped feeling things on purpose, you have met someone like Dominic. He was tall and broad, hard through the shoulders, with a jaw like carved stone. He had ruled the Ironclaw Pack for 11 years, and in all that time, nobody had ever seen him laugh. Nobody had seen him weep. His warriors respected him. His enemies feared him, but nobody loved him, and that was the way he wanted it, because Dominic had loved once, and it had ruined him. Years ago, he'd had a mate. The bond between them had been real, the kind of mate bond that only comes once in a lifetime. And then he had been told a lie, a poison whispered in his ear by someone who wanted what he had. He was told his mate had betrayed him, that she had lain with another man and carried a child that was not his. And Dominic, in his rage and his pride, had cast her out, banished her from the pack with nothing. He never checked the story. He never asked for proof. He just believed the worst, and he threw her out into the cold. He never spoke her name again. He built a wall around his heart so high that nothing got in, and the pack learned quickly. You did not mention the past to the king. You did not ask about the woman he sent away. You bowed and you obeyed and you stayed out of his path. Only one creature in that whole stronghold was still allowed close to him, an old gray wolfhound named Ash. Ash had been at Dominic's side for 12 years, since he was a pup. The dog slept at the foot of the king's bed and followed him through the halls. Ash was the one warm thing left in a cold man's life. And Ash, believe me, is going to matter more than you think. So that was the world Bram lived in. A stronghold ruled by a king who had frozen his own heart. A mother who scrubbed floors to keep her boy alive. And a winter feast coming where the tables would groan under more food than a low-born family saw in a year. That's where our story really begins. The winter feast was the biggest night of the year. Every warrior, every family, every servant crowded into the great hall. The fires roared. The tables ran the whole length of the room, piled with roasted meat and bread and steaming pots of stew. The smell of it filled every corner. And for the lowborn who worked the kitchens, the rule was simple. You served, you cleaned, and you did not eat until the highborn were finished if there was anything left at all. Mara worked that night carrying platters until her arms shook. And Bram, who was too small to be left alone, sat tucked in the corner by the kitchen door, watching all that food go by. He had not eaten a real meal in 2 days. His mother had given him her share both times and told him she wasn't hungry, and he had been too young to know she was lying. Now he sat there and the smell of the roasted meat filled his whole small body, and his stomach twisted and cramped until it hurt. He watched the head table most of all. Because at the head table sat the king, and in front of the king was a plate piled high with the finest cuts of all. Dominic barely touched it. He ate a few bites, brooding, staring at nothing, the way he always did. And a whole slab of meat sat there in front of him, untouched, going cold. Bram watched that meat. He watched it the way a starving child watches food, and something in his small, tired mind made a decision that no lowborn child should ever have made. He stood up. Mara didn't see him. She was across the hall, her back turned, stacking bowls. And by the time she felt that cold drop in her stomach that every mother knows, by the time she turned around, her son was already gone from the corner. He was walking toward the head table. You have to understand how insane this was. A lowborn child walking straight up the center of the hall toward the throne of the coldest king in the mountains. People noticed. Conversations died as he passed. A serving woman reached out to grab him and missed. Someone hissed at him to stop, but Bram kept walking, slow and small, his bare feet quiet on the stone. He walked right up to the head table. He stood in front of Alpha King Dominic Thornwood, and the whole hall began to go quiet, table by table, until you could hear the fire crackle. One of the king's men saw the boy and reacted first. His fist came down on the table right next to Bram, hard enough to rattle the cups, meant to scare the child off. Bram flinched. He dropped low. But he did not run. He got back to his feet. His knees were shaking. His whole body was shaking. But he looked up at that mountain of a man on the throne, and in a small, clear voice, he asked the question that would change everything. "May I eat what you did not finish?" Nobody breathed, 200 people, and not one of them made a sound. Somewhere across the hall, Mara had gone completely white, one hand pressed over her mouth, frozen in horror. Dominic looked down at the boy, and here is where it turns, here is the moment. The king opened his mouth to say something cold, to send the boy away or worse, but then he looked into the child's face. He looked into those pale silver eyes, and the words died in his throat, because he knew those eyes. He saw those eyes every single morning in his own mirror, that exact rare shade of silver. He had never seen it on another living soul, and now here it was, staring up at him from the face of a starving, low-born boy. Something moved through the room then, something none of them could name. And that's when Ash got up. The old gray wolfhound had been lying by the fire half asleep for the whole feast. Now he lifted his head. He rose to his feet slow and stiff, and he walked past the king, past the warriors, straight to the small trembling boy. And Ash lowered his great gray head and laid it gently in Bram's lap, and he would not move. The dog that trusted no one but the king, the dog that growled at strangers. He pressed himself against that child like he had found something he'd been looking for his whole long life. Dominic stared at the two of them. His jaw worked. Something crossed his hard face that no one in that hall had seen in years. For a long moment, the king of the Ironclaw pack could not speak at all. Then he did something that made every person in that room gasp. He pushed his own plate across the table, toward the boy, and in a low, rough voice he said, "Eat." Bram looked up at him, not sure it was real. Then he reached out with both thin hands and pulled the plate close and began to eat fast, the way starving children eat. Ash stayed pressed against his side the whole time, and slowly, the hall let out its breath. The tension broke. People turned back to their tables. Someone laughed nervously. It was just a hungry child, they told themselves. Just a strange, soft moment from a hard king. It was over. Mara rushed forward, bowing, apologizing, tears streaming down her face, and pulled her son away by the hand, murmuring, thank you, my lord, forgive him." And she hurried Bram back toward the kitchen. Dominic said nothing. He watched them go, and the feast went on. Mara took her son back to their little room off the kitchen. She was shaking. She held his face in her hands and checked him over and told him never, ever to do that again. But Bram had a full belly for the first time in days, and he was already growing sleepy. She tucked him into the straw bed and pulled the thin blanket over him and sat there in the dark, her heart finally starting to slow. He was safe. He had eaten. No one had hurt him. She let herself breathe. She told herself the worst was over. It was not over. It was only just beginning. Because up in the great hall, the king was not the only one who had noticed those silver eyes. A woman named Selene had been watching from her seat near the head table. Selene was highborn, sharp and beautiful and patient. And Selene was the one. She was the one who, years ago, had whispered the lie into Dominic's ear. She was the one who had wanted him for herself, who had destroyed his mate to clear her own path to the throne. And Selene remembered that banished woman's eyes. Pale, silver, rare. She had just watched a low-born child with those exact same eyes ask the king for scraps. She had watched the king's own dog choose that child over everyone in the room, and she was not a fool. She could count. She could see, plain as day, what everyone else had missed. That boy was the right age. That boy had the king's eyes. That boy was the child she had sworn to Dominic did not exist. Her whole world was built on a lie, and that lie had just walked into the great hall on two small bare feet and asked for meat. So while Mara sat in the dark believing her son was safe, Selene rose from her seat. She smoothed her dress, and she went quietly to find two men she trusted, men who owed her, men who would do a thing in the night and never speak of it. She told them there was a kitchen woman and a boy who needed to disappear before morning, not banished, not thrown out, gone for good, no witnesses. You see how the whole thing just changed. An hour ago, this was a story about a hungry child and a cold king. Now it's a story about a woman covering a murder with another murder. It's not about pride anymore. It's about survival. Two lives, a mother and a small boy asleep in the dark, and someone in the walls of that stronghold deciding they would not see the sun come up. And Mara had no idea. She kissed her sleeping son's forehead and lay down beside him and closed her eyes. If you have made it this far with me and your heart is already with that little boy, do me one favor and hit that subscribe button. It costs you nothing, and it helps this story reach one more person who needs to hear how it ends. Now stay close, because it all happens fast from here. The door to the kitchen opened without a sound. Mara was not fully asleep. She had that mother's instinct that never truly switches off. She heard the wrong kind of quiet. She heard a floorboard take a slow, careful weight, and she was on her feet in the dark before she even knew why, standing between the door and her sleeping son. Two men came through into the little room, big men. She could see the shape of them against the faint glow of the kitchen coals. One of them held a length of cord, the other held a knife. Mara did not scream. She had learned long ago that no one comes when a lowborn screams. Instead, she grabbed the only thing near her hand, a heavy iron pot, and she swung it into the first man's head with everything she had. He staggered. Bram woke up crying. And the second man lunged past her toward the bed, toward the boy, and Mara threw herself onto his back and clawed and fought like an animal defending its young. She was a healer, not a warrior. She was thin and half-starved, but she fought. She bought seconds with her own body, and in a stronghold made of stone where sound travels down long halls, those seconds were enough for one thing to happen. The boy screamed, and Ash heard him. Down the corridor, in the king's chambers, the old gray wolfhound came off the floor barking like a hound half his age. He scratched and threw himself at the door, wild, frantic, in a way Dominic had never once seen in 12 years. Dominic, who had not been able to sleep, who had been sitting awake staring at the fire thinking about a pair of silver eyes, opened the door. And Ash was gone, tearing down the hall toward the kitchens, following a sound only he had heard. Dominic grabbed his sword and ran after him. The king burst into the kitchen to a scene of chaos. A woman on the floor, bleeding from her scalp, still holding the ankle of a man trying to shake her off. A child pressed into the corner, screaming. And the old wolfhound already there, jaws locked on the wrist of a man holding a knife, dragging him back from the boy with a fury that no one could have called out of him. Dominic moved before he thought. He was the strongest fighter in the north, and these were hired knives, and it was not even close. He put one man on the ground with the flat of his blade. The other tried to run, and Dominic caught him by the throat and slammed him against the stone wall and held him there, feet off the floor. "Who sent you?" the king said. His voice was very quiet. That is always the most dangerous kind of quiet. The man was choking, terrified, and terrified men talk. He gave up the name in 3 seconds. Selene. "Lady Selene sent us. She said the woman and the boy had to disappear. She said they'd ruin everything." And Dominic went still. He turned. He looked at the woman on the floor who was pulling herself up now, reaching for her son, gathering the crying child into her arms and pressing his face into her shoulder to shield his eyes. And in the light of the coals, for the first time in years, Dominic saw her face. He knew her. The years fell away and he knew her. Thinner now, older, worn down to almost nothing, but it was her. It was the mate he had cast out into the cold. The woman whose name he had forbidden anyone to speak. She was alive. She was here. She had been here, scrubbing his floors, sleeping in his walls, and he had walked past her 100 times and never once looked at her face. And in her arms was a boy, 6 years old, with his eyes. Dominic did the math right there, standing in that kitchen, and I want you to feel what that math did to him. 6 years old. She had been carrying when he threw her out. The child she was accused of carrying by another man. The lie he never checked. The lie he believed because it was easier than trust. That boy was his son. He had banished his own pregnant mate on the word of the woman who now, tonight, had sent knives to finish the job. The king of the Ironclaw pack, the man who never wept, dropped to his knees on the kitchen floor. Mara pulled back from him. Of course she did. This was the man who had destroyed her life, who had thrown her out to die, who had let her scrub his floors while her son starved. She held Bram tighter and she looked at Dominic with a fear and a fury that 11 years of silence could not hold anymore. "Do not touch him," she said. Her voice was shaking, but it did not break. "You threw us away. He nearly died a dozen times because of you. Do not you dare touch my son now." Dominic did not argue. He did not pull rank. He did not order. He just knelt there on the cold stone, this huge, powerful man made small. And he said the only true thing he had. I know. I know what I did. I believed a lie because I was too proud to ask for the truth, and I have paid for it every single day, though not half as much as you have. I have no right to ask you for anything, but he is my son, and I will spend whatever is left of my life making it right, starting tonight." Ash left the doorway then and crossed the room and lay down between them, between the mother and the father and the child, like he was trying to hold the broken family together with his own tired body. And Bram, peeking out from his mother's shoulder, looked at the kneeling king and asked, in that same small, clear voice from the feast, "Are you going to send us away again?" That question from that child broke something loose in Dominic that 11 years of stone had held shut, and the coldest king in the mountains put his face in his hands and wept. What Dominic did next, he did in front of the whole pack in the daylight where everyone could see. He did not hide it. He did not handle it quietly to protect his own name. He called every warrior, every family, every servant into the great hall the next morning, and he stood before them holding the hand of a thin, low-born boy and beside a woman in a worn gray dress, and he told them the truth. He told them all of it. The mate bond he had thrown away, the lie he had believed, the banishment. He told them that the woman they had treated as the lowest of the low was his true mate, and that the child who had asked for scraps at his own table was his son and the true-born heir of the Ironclaw pack. He said the shame was his and his alone, and that anyone who had ever been cruel to these two had been cruel on his account, and he would carry that for the rest of his days. Then he had Selene brought before the whole hall. She tried her old tricks, the tears, the denials, the pretty words, but the men she had hired had already confessed, and the king's dog had chosen the boy in front of 200 witnesses, and everyone in that hall could see the silver eyes for themselves now. Her lie had held for 6 years on the strength of Dominic's pride, and Dominic's pride was gone. He stripped her of her name and her rank and cast her out of the pack, into the same cold he had once thrown his own mate into. There was a kind of hard justice in it that nobody missed. She left with nothing, the way Mara had left with nothing. But Mara had left with a child in her belly and a will to live, and had built a life out of scraps. Selene left with only her cruelty. What she made of the cold was her own affair. Then Dominic turned back to the two people who mattered. Now, I want to be honest with you, because a true story about a broken family is not a story where everything mends in a single morning. It didn't. Mara did not fall back into his arms. Why would she? She had 11 years of scars and a body worn thin from surviving him. Forgiveness like that is not a gift you hand over at the snap of a finger. It has to be earned day after day, and both of them knew it. So Dominic earned it, slowly. He did not move them into fine rooms and expect that to fix things. He asked Mara what she wanted, and then he listened, which was a thing he had never once done when it mattered. She wanted her name back, not the floor woman, not the lowborn, Mara Voss, the healer. So he gave her back her old rooms, the ones she'd had before, and he sent word through every village that the great healer had returned. And warriors began to line up outside her door again, and mothers began to bless her name again. And slowly the woman the pack had looked away from became a person they looked up to. He fed his son. That first thing, the simplest thing, he never stopped doing. Bram never went hungry another day in his life. The cough that had scared Mara through so many winters eased and then faded, the way a sickness fades when a child finally has enough to eat and a warm place to sleep. The boy filled out. He grew. He laughed, which he had not done much of before because hungry, frightened children do not laugh. And Dominic learned how to be a father the way a clumsy man learns anything, by getting it wrong and trying again. He was not good at it at first. He was stiff and unsure, and he did not know how to talk to a small boy. But Bram was patient with him, gentler with his father than his father had ever been with anyone. And Ash, old Ash, went everywhere the boy went. The dog had chosen, that night at the feast, and the dog never once changed his mind. Here is a thing I did not tell you before. That whole time Bram had a little carved wooden wolf that he kept in his pocket. His mother had made it for him from a scrap of kitchen firewood, whittled by candlelight over many nights because they had no money for toys. It was the only thing he owned. And after everything, when Dominic asked his son if there was anything in the whole stronghold that he wanted, anything at all, Bram thought about it and reached into his pocket and held up that little wooden wolf and said he already had the best thing. He just wanted his mother to stop looking so tired. That more than anything is what finally reached Mara. Not the rooms, not the name. The sight of her son, safe and full and unafraid, holding up a scrap of firewood and calling it the best thing he owned. She had kept that boy alive through years that would have broken anyone. And now, at last, she got to watch him simply be a child. The bond between mates does not die just because a fool tries to kill it. It had gone quiet in her, buried under years of pain, but it had never gone out. And as the seasons turned and Dominic kept showing up, kept choosing them, kept being gentle where he had once been cruel, something in Mara that had been clenched tight for a very long time slowly began to loosen. I will not tell you she forgot. She never forgot. But she forgave. In her own time, on her own terms, because she chose to, not because he asked. And the mountains, which had known the Ironclaw pack as the strongest pack in the north and the coldest, came to know it as something else. A place with a healer who could pull a fever out of a child in a single night. A king who had learned the hardest way there is, that pride is the most expensive thing a man can carry. And a silver-eyed boy who grew up knowing exactly how much he was loved. Think back to how this all started. A starving child creeping up to a table, shaking, asking a cold king if he could eat the food he did not want. That was the smallest, most powerless moment you can imagine. A little boy with nothing, asking for scraps, and it turned out to be the moment that gave him everything. Because sometimes the smallest voice in the room is the one that finally speaks the truth that no one else dared to say. Bram did not know his father sat on that throne. He did not know a lie had shaped his whole hungry life. He only knew he was hungry and he was brave enough to ask. And that one small, honest question pulled down a wall that 11 years of pride had built. That's where I'll leave them. A mother who never gave up. A father who finally learned how to love. An old gray dog who knew the truth before anyone else did, and a boy who asked for scraps and got a whole world instead. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end of this one. If it touched you, leave a word below and tell me. And I will see you in the next story.